I know that we have several people joining us online, so I'm going to start with a couple of quick things about the online audience today. We have a relatively small group in here, and what we are proposing is that if you would like to join us and actually converse with us, that we get you to send us an email. If you've got something to say, email your phone number and we will call you and put you on speakerphone in the room. Okay, so we'll be monitoring the email for that purpose. So you can send emails to coreclinic1@gmail.com at any point. We can read out any questions that you have as we normally do. But we're also proposing, if you would like to say it yourself and make a comment, then send us your phone number and we will make a call out on the speakerphone. Okay? So that's a little bit different. The other thing that we always start with is just what are the next things coming up, just to make sure that everybody knows what is planned. And in particular, it matters this time because we have a change of plans as of today. If you look at our website, it still says that our next event is October 24th and is a to be announced topic. However, it is not. It is October 17th, and the topic is Words Matter, managing ourselves when giving and receiving feedback. Okay? Carrie Boyle is going to present this and has been planning quite a few interesting things about the giving and receiving of feedback. But we've been really fortunate to find a time when Julie Daum is going to be physically in Vancouver, and hence the change of date to October 17th, so Julie can join us. Those of you who may have been on Twitter at the beginning of September may be aware that Julie was involved in some fairly interesting exchanges with Jan Arden. And
who might be famous for interesting exchanges.
Yeah, exactly. But definitely an interesting insight into the giving and receiving of feedback that we're hoping Julie will be able to talk about. The other date is November 15th. That is our ethics workshop with Carrie Gallant. One little bit of extra information with respect to the ethics workshop this year. As always, it's 2 hours. It's an active workshop. However, we are working with Mediate BC to see if there's a possibility of getting appropriate online access so that we can actually have online groups participating too. So we're trying to expand the reach. You'll remember we tried a little bit last year, but our WebEx limited the numbers of people who could participate online in a group. We're looking at different ways to do it. So if you're thinking of doing it online, send me a note really early because that'll help us figure out numbers and figure out exactly what we can do. All right. So from there, we're going to talk about conflict resolution and fringe theater. Ashley, I'm going to kind of turn it to you to introduce yourself and talk about kind of how you come at this topic.
Sure. So for those of you in the room and online who don't know me, my name is Ashley Sire. I am a lawyer, a mediator, a performer, a photographer, a Jill of many trades. But this year I was fortunate enough to be performing in a fringe show. It was a musical called Carry On. That took place entirely in the international baggage claim area of the YVR airport. Anybody who spent any time there may have some ideas about conflict, as did the writers of the show. So the show, in a nutshell, for those of you who didn't see it, was about some airport employees who had their own issues and personal baggage, if you will, and then some arriving passengers from flight 2771 from LA whose bags had gone missing. And then conflict, comedy, and music ensued from there. And so it was actually a fascinating show to be a part of as a performer, because it was a brand new piece of theater, but also from the point of view of a mediator and somebody who works in conflict resolution, because this show was all about conflict. It was people wanting to get where they were going, but things had happened to them along the way that they were dealing with or not dealing with. And the baggage, the physical bags were sort of a metaphor for the other baggage that was going on. So this idea of fringe theater and conflict resolution was fascinating because I was looking at it from the point of view of a performer acting out these conflict situations, but also thinking well, how would I as a real person better have dealt with this? So
that's actually a great frame, because one of the things I was going to talk about a little bit, Ashley, was kind of different ideas, because and this is more just framing where we're going to go with the conversation, because I'm definitely going to invite others to be participating in it, but framing the different ways that you can engage with theater from a perspective that might assist you some way in conflict resolution. And so that's like a couple different layers in terms of what your engagement was. As a performer, obviously there's a different kind of engagement with the material than when you're watching it. And there's always that overlay of the mediators. So, but your play was very much specifically a conflict.
It really was.
Yeah. And in fact, a series of conflicts. And
everybody was in conflict in some way or other.
Yeah, and their personal backstories. I did get the chance to see Ashley's play, which was great, because it was these mini, usually a set of passengers would have their own interpersonal conflict in addition to the overlay of the luggage. So you probably had 10 different disputes going on in the course of an hour. Each being dealt with differently and with different personality styles and different conflict approaches. So from the perspective of the kinds of things theater can do, like I think one of the things that we think of immediately is you could actually just show conflict and different ways that it evolves and different ways. And I think Carry On might have been the best for that, actually, in the entire Fringe, because it had the most of it.
It did. And I think you saw the not the fully staged version.
No, I saw it.
which created even further conflict. But just modeling the conflict. I think it was interesting for some people watching the pieces of conflict happening, rather than being a part of it, going, oh wow, if you approach something this way, that's what that looks like. Which was fascinating.
Kind of that self-recognition moment of, oh yeah, I do that. I think actually just having that many little conflicts going on actually gives you that moment of what's my own style a little bit.
Yeah, and one of the things that was really interesting kind of in the background of that show when we were developing it, because it was a new piece of theater, I got to be involved in a lot of the development of it. One of the discussions that we kept having was behavior in public space versus private space, and at what point you forget you're in public in your conflict. And it's an interesting thing for mediation, because when you're in a joint session, you're kind of in a public space in a way. It's a protected public space, but it's still sort of a public space, but sometimes things just fly out of you that you might not otherwise say in a public space. So that was a really interesting conversation that we had, and a layer of perspective maybe that I know I hadn't really considered before we delved into it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, all right. I'm gonna go on to the framing of what we want to talk about, and I'm also kind of looking around for people to contribute ideas about what else they want to talk about. But one of the ways I didn't really introduce myself, mostly because I think I know virtually everybody who's online as well. I know everybody who RSVP'd about being online anyway. But something that maybe people don't know about me is that before I went into law and mediation, I did a master's in theater, and then I did most of my PhD in theater in the University of Toronto. So I do have a pretty strong academic background in theater, and I did lots of theater, just lots more stage management and performance actually, and direction, but I was involved in a lot of different things behind the scenes in theater. And part of that led to my being recruited when I was leaving UBC, and made the mistake of saying out loud that I would have so much more time now. I don't know what came over me, but I said it out loud in a public space. It was a very bad mistake. And a colleague said, really? Because I'm on the Fringe board and we're recruiting somebody. We really desperately need somebody with a legal background, and we'd love somebody with conflict resolution. So I ended up on I've been on the board of directors for the Fringe for the last 2 years as well, and so have actually had some interesting interactions with the theater in different ways. So those are the kind of the couple ways that I'm most currently coming at theater. And part of that resulted in my doing this whole little academic-y exercise about thinking about theater and what it brings. And I think, so I was kind of thinking in terms of, okay, you've got this whole, yes, you can have and capture a conflict in a play. And you have a chance to watch it played out in a way that is really unique. It's different than we've done, reading groups and talked about reading it in a book. It's very different when you're watching it. And there's a whole visceral element to it being live theater that is dramatically different, I think, than watching it on TV or elsewhere. So you've got this engagement. And I think there's quite a few layers that we can talk about and dig into about just watching the conflict, the kinds of things Ashley's talking about what do you observe as a conflict resolution professional when you're seeing something in conflict on the stage. Now, I was saying before everybody got here that one of the things I found interesting was when I reached out to the executive director of the Fringe and said, could you make a choice of a few plays that might be really good to look at? As somebody outside the conflict resolution world, his immediate thing was to actually give a list of plays that all did that. They're all about conflicts that play out on the stage, because from outside the conflict resolution world, I think that's the most natural thing that we think of, right? Like that's the default is, ooh, mediators would really like to see conflict. Yeah, I know, exactly. But it sort of makes sense that's, and I think that is one of the most valuable things that we can do. And one of the reasons why Carry On was on my recommendation list was for exactly that, because I think it gives you something to dig into and talk about. But I was looking at a bunch of other things, and I'm going to put them out here at the beginning so that we can kind of come and engage in whatever order that we want to as a conversation. I think that more you can actually see different kinds of people engaged with different kinds of skills that you might not learn in a conflict resolution training setting. There's some really obvious ones. I think many of us have talked about improv theater and the kinds of skills that you learn as an improviser, for instance, and the way they can really directly go into your work as a mediator or a conflict resolution professional. And so any kind of performance that involves an improvisational aspect is going to have layers of active listening, because that is the core of being an improv performer, is listening and being able to respond to. And the words they even use in improv training is accepting offers. And it's a funny word for us as conflict resolution professionals, because we think that means about, the actual settlement offer and things like that. But in the improv world, to accept an offer is to not just rebut and shoot down something that has been offered as something to play off of. So something that is given to you orally to respond to, something that is a performance, might be simply just mannerisms or some behavior that you can play off of. All of those are offers as part of an improvisational act. And so there's all these different ways that we can look at improv and learn from it. But I think even deeper, if you take some of those active listening skills and watch them with really skilled performers in really unique settings, I think we can learn something that's beyond and might actually bring a really fresh and new lens to the way that we listen and participate in dispute resolution context. And the one example that I've mentioned it to a few people before, but I was absolutely blown away at last year's Fringe by a woman who did a play called The Story of Oz, and she's a phone sex operator, and the story is her going through some interchanges that she would have had as a phone sex operator. She also included a complete improv session, which was quite fantastic, dealing with audience ideas about what the call might look like. So you had that, but on another level, I don't think I've ever seen anything that captured listening, accepting, right, having no judgment whatsoever, and finding a way to be empathetic around whatever she was hearing. And it was actually quite astonishing to walk away and go, okay, so as part of this theater thing, we need to be thinking about the ways that other professions, acting is one of them, but it goes further than that, how there's these places we could learn the skills, and we can really, I walked away really admiring it as one of the best mediations I'd ever seen as she was demonstrating her skill set. So skills is another group that I would say can be demonstrated in different ways, and they might give us insights. I think when Ashley's talking about carry on, it kind of falls into what I think categorizes as the poor skills category.
Generally, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. So you can see the poor skills. I don't know if anybody here has seen any of the David Williams plays, though. Australian author, dramatist, who went through a series of writing plays that were on workplace disputes. And they were actually, the entire play would be about the playing out of the process. And I know, and I was going to look it up and I failed, and I apologize for this, but I know that in February in New York, a group of mediators put together a play and staged it off Broadway that was based on neighborhood disputes. So you also get those like explicit, like not just let's do the extrapolation, but let's actually put our performance on stage. And again, I think it's really viscerally different than watching it somewhere else when you're seeing people on stage doing that. So that's another one. Another category I was proposing was the difficult personalities category, right? I think a lot of them fall into a demonstration of understanding high conflict personality in a way that you might not be able to engage with it other places. Well performed performances might get you there, but they'll also show you other kinds and okay, I'm going to say my very favorite play, I'm sorry Ashley, it wasn't yours this year, but my very favorite play, this Fringe, it won the prize actually for artistic risk this year, Nerdfucker. And I would say an entirely different category, it falls into the personality one. It's an entire play of conflict avoidance. And it is a beautiful, fully formed picture of a woman who is more and more obviously avoiding conflicts and actually damaging herself as a result of it. But as a study from a conflict resolution perspective, it's fascinating to watch this play out as she talks about all these various things that come out. So that's another one. And I guess the other piece that I had was kind of the you can learn about other people. Just that whole culture might be part of it, might be part of the package. We can learn about different voices and the way that people tell their stories can help us to engage, I think, in a dispute resolution format by simply grasping differences because we've seen them played out. And I think that kind of goes, anyway, styles, all the rest. So I'm thinking, I want to talk about all of those kinds of things. And I put it out there, and now I would like to kind of, I don't know, I'm going to go to you, Ashley, and just say, is there anywhere you want to go with this? The two things we need to cover off for sure. We need to talk about does not play well with others.
Yes.
Because I think most people went to it. And in addition to that, Ashley and I participated in a workshop.
Yes. I wish I had brought mine. We could have had a whole
play.
Yes. Hello. Yeah.
So I want to talk about both of those aspects, and then also kind of open it up for other conversations with everybody. So
sounds good.
I'm going to pass it to you and let you say where would you like to go, and we can look around the room and see where people want to go to.
Yeah. Did you guys see Does Not Play Well with Others? Yeah. Some of us did. We could start there. So
Sure.
If that works. Yeah. It was a great show. For those of you who didn't see it, Does Not Play Well with Others was a story. It was a play about two puppeteers on a network, sort of like a public TV network that were doing. They were the puppets for a children's show. it was actually a really fascinating look at sort of conflict through these puppets, but the conflict of the puppet operators, and the conflict that they were having with their network. And it also had some interesting sort of mental health aspects tied into it, all with puppets, which was an unexpected thing. What I found actually really, one of the many things I found so interesting about that particular show was that there were only 2 actors and the 2 puppets, but the conflict involved a lot of people who were not in the room. And I think that's something that is so common in what we do in conflict resolution, where you've got parties who have come to the table to deal with whatever conflict it is that they're dealing with, but they are maybe not the only people who are affected or who are involved, and so you're sort of watching that play out.
No, I think that was an interesting aspect of it, actually. They managed to bring it in by having some video. They had some other kinds of, there was a Skype, so you saw the computer screen, you didn't hear anything, but there was an engagement with a psychologist, and so they were playing out things and purportedly talking to somebody else at the same time. So I thought they created a great sense of that there were all these other people by making the references and
it was great.
What that said to me, and part of the question that I had, the play within the play, and it sounds like your play was the same thing. So, and how do we deal with that kind of thing in mediation? Because it happens all the time. You're going down one road, and all of a sudden there's this road over here. So you've got all these little different stories going on at the same time, and then they use they use the sock puppets for yet another story. And then the Skyping, to me that worked. It's interesting because you talked about drama on the stage being more powerful, and it is, but then they use the technology of Skype, which I thought was really powerful as well. We always say technology removes, and it does, but in this case it seemed to work as well. So I guess my question is, how we see the little plays within a play, and how can we use those in dealing with mediation, and is that a caucus activity, or is that something just to kind of bring forth and identify as part of the main process, and those kind of questions? And it sounds like with the play that you were doing, similar kind of situation.
Yeah, well, and it's I think kind of an interesting thing to be able to take those conflicts that are happening within the conflict and then sort of segment them out a little bit to kind of deal with them and then put them back in the whole. In Does Not Play Well with Others, I think that was those Skype sessions. But what I thought was so interesting is that this psychologist who's theoretically on the other side of the screen is telling them both, "Well, take off your socks and be your puppets." And it was, what was so interesting to me was that these it works for these 2 because they're puppeteers, but the things that would come out of the puppets that wouldn't have come out of their own mouths.
Well, and the socks
were
a lot more intimate than the big puppets.
Yeah. But it was, what I thought was so great about it was a way for these people dealing with conflict to detach themselves a bit from their own conflict and deal with it a little bit as though it's somebody else's, it's an outside look at their internal issue. And that I thought was really interesting about, when we're dealing with these situations where you've got somebody who's clearly dealing with their own issue, or an issue that's not necessarily connected to what's being mediated, finding a way to get them to express what it is in maybe a more creative way.
Yeah, I very much agree, and kind of one of the things, Ashley and I were both in that workshop with Adam Francis Prue, who was the puppeteer, the male puppeteer on that show, and he did a workshop the next day for the Dispute Resolution Conference for CLE, and that's where these come from, because he actually gave us all little things so that we could practice. And it was a 2-hour workshop. It was actually really fascinating, and he took us through our paces to try and actually engage and connect. Where do you see the eyeballs? What's the important thing to see? So there were some interesting things from a pure puppeting perspective. but most of them translated. And I thought one of the things that translated the most and was a really explicit part of what he was trying to get us to get at was exactly that distancing element. And how do you create distance so that you can be talking about it? And it was fascinating to see how, sure, we're all standing there, we all know each other reasonably well, we're all doing these little things with our puppets and feeling stupid. But at the same time, it was fascinating what you could say and do and try, and there was still a distance even in the learning process. And it reminded me of a few different techniques that I know I use in mediation, and I'm curious if others have the same kind of thing, but things that almost anything that kind of breaks it and distances and has you talking somewhere else. At a really simplistic level, I started to think after the workshop about the fact that, okay, so this distancing is really explicit, and it might be hard, and there might be really specific circumstances in which you could, give some eyeballs out and say googly eyes and do something. But there's probably a lot more circumstances where we're experiencing it. And the phone is one of them. Because I actually was having the speaker phone, it's distancing in a way because we're yelling into a different place and we're not seeing each other. And you have that same kind of engagement with something that isn't really the person. And I think there's a bunch of things that we maybe don't take advantage of because we don't think of them as distancing. I don't know if others are having that same kind of reaction. You can turn the camera.
Yes, I can.
I'm not in charge.
I think for me, and the Skyping I think really worked because it puts you on camera, so it's another form of stage. So rather than removing the person from the situation, it actually puts a spotlight on them. So they're actually a little bit more personal and a little bit more intimate. That's what I found anyhow, which we don't expect, but it actually creates more of a kind of a situation where, involved, engaged.
Well, and you're also really staring at the person's face too.
Well, that's just
when
it.
You
That's
can
just
avert
it.
your eyes more easily in a room than you can when you're staring at somebody's whole face, covering,
Well, that's just it.
taking up the screen.
Yeah. It's really hard to pull out your phone and start checking messages when you're the entire screen, right? So,
Although those are actually kind of they're interesting counterparts because they're in different ways you want to do different things at different times, right? Because one of the reasons why you do get studies that will show higher settlement rates with certain types of cases with a speakerphone probably have a great deal to do with that distancing, with the fact that you don't see the person. That there's the eye rolling going on behind. Those, I know, like Suzanne, you're involved in some of the administrative kinds of ones, and certainly in small claims that was something. It's specific types of things where it may not be ongoing relationship, but some of those studies have demonstrated something about distancing and separating can actually increase settlement rates. Whereas, interestingly, what you're talking about with the Skype, I know that one of the studies they were showing on the family online dispute resolution process was that one of the values of Skype was that you saw yourself as well. It wasn't as much that you were seeing the other person. It was that you see your own face.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And it is super hard to be really obnoxious when you're seeing your face.
When you can see.
That's what I look like when I do that. So
interesting
interesting it's interesting that the puppets are kind of giving rise to the technology discussion in a sense, but that is sort of what distancing is like what's the level of engagement we have and how do we do it?
It's, in a tribunal experience, you're talking about using Skype. Used it not with the face, but just for the voice purposes once for an expert witness. And it's funny when you talk about that. So you have the voice from on high as the expert, but nobody in the room, and whether that tends to give a different feel to how much expertise there is there or not.
Right.
And an interesting comment on that. Where does that voice come from? But I like the concept that when you see your own face on Skype, you're in a different experience. You are watching yourself as well.
It seems it's the opposite of when you've got something like the eyeballs or like whatever we were using, where you are putting yourself into this, and you can speak more freely here than you can, here.
Although arguably you can speak more freely, but you hear yourself saying it.
Yeah.
So you might have a
An
different
interesting
reaction
level
too.
of, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that would happen or not, but
Yeah.
it's an interesting
Yeah.
concept.
And I think, I was just gonna say, nothing to do with plays, because I missed all the plays,
Yeah.
but the concept of distancing or not distancing, the concept of running hearing management meetings, and especially with people who are self-represented in what that adds to a hearing process. And there's a difference between, and I've done it both ways, doing hearing management meetings on phone and doing hearing management meetings gathered together in a room.
Yeah.
And I would say it's much better to do it in a room, face to face, because it breaks down some of the barriers for those who are self-represented, because they get to see and notice the people, and it's in an informal setting. On a telephone, again, the voice only, I think, gives a different different feeling to the whole process.
Well, I'm going to kind of just come back to does not play well with others, and just another aspect of it that we didn't really highlight. It's kind of, I think it fits in another category of those plays and things that we do with conflict resolution. That's not just representing here's some people out there having a dispute, but it has a bit of a current reference. There's no question that it had some kind of reference and inspiration from the Ghomeshi scandal. And so you were getting those kind of flavors and overlaps, so that there's commentary on current issues. The fact that there were in the body of the play, in the script itself, there would be references to Bill Cosby and other kinds of things that would make it really explicit, that we're thinking about those kind of things, and we're in this time frame, and these are the sorts of things we're thinking about. It just struck me that was kind of another thing this play raised as a question, is kind of just the way that you can actually grapple with something that might be really difficult. It might be really difficult to sit down and have a long discussion about different challenges, but you can take one aspect of it and stage it and engage with it in a different way, because it's separate as well. And I'm getting that, I'm obviously riffing off of the distancing notion, but I feel like in a sense, simply scripting something out of current but making it clearly fictional is also a distancing technique to discuss something that's a difficult concept.
Yeah, it was a bit like using hypotheticals. I mean, in a different sort of way, rather than using a pure hypothetical, you're just using something that's happening outside of whatever it is that you're dealing with.
Yeah, anyway, I just thought it was interesting, because I could imagine, this is obviously, there's sensitivity around the topics. It was placed in this frame where it was separate, it was distanced by being fictional, it was distanced by being a children's show and comedy and puppets, and yet it was managing to grapple with a fairly difficult topic generally. So it's interesting how theater allows that conversation to take place, and I'm just curious as to how that plays out. Conflict resolution, what we do to create the same kind of spaces. Hypotheticals, for sure.
Yeah, it's just something. Well, I mean, it is. It's exactly distancing. You're just creating a. I think sometimes for certain personality types of people and in certain types of conflict, where they're having a difficult time dealing directly with what their issue is, or the issue that they're trying to deal with is. But if you say, well, here's a scenario, how would it go in this scenario? I think for a lot of those people, it's much easier to say, oh, well, this is how it should go. And you say, well, isn't this kind of like this? It's that, separating yourself thing, where you're taking yourself out and hearing yourself say what it is that you can't say about your own situation.
It also kind of helps to normalize the situation a bit, kind of calm things down, and just this is not a unique situation. There are other situations that have happened like this or similar to this, so it kind of takes the sting out of it a little bit and calms people down enough to be able to discuss certain aspects of it, or certain ways of dealing with the situation.
So, Ashley, I'm going to kind of shift and suggest, because we were talking about the one thing, the distancing that came
Yeah.
out of Adam's workshop.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that he was talking about was breaking it down.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that? 'Cause
Yeah.
I feel like that was something else that I took out of the workshop anyway.
Yeah, I did as well. It was really interesting. I mean, he was approaching it from a puppeting point of view. You know, so when the puppet is going to do this, these are all the components of it. You know, so if the puppet's going to say something, first they breathe, which means they do this, and then they speak, which is an open and then a close, and then if there's a question, then there's a head tilt. And you know, it was all these small things that go into one action. I actually thought it was so interesting talking about the breath
Yeah.
that went into it, because that was getting me thinking about when you're observing, you know, for us doing, you know, not just our active listening, but when you're observing the people in your room, watching the breathing, watching, you know, I think it's fair to say that everybody knows they need to be aware of body language, and to some degree are. But I think, you know, when we're sitting there with our eyeballs on our hands, thinking, you know, okay, well, if it's a question, well, then there's a head tilt, and then the head goes, and then, you know, the breathing, even at the beginning when we had the paper, we had scrunched up paper, and the paper was the puppet, and we had to make the paper breathe. The scrunched up ball of paper. And so, you know, which sounds like the most ridiculous thing, but what it did was it was forcing you to think about breath, and forcing you to think about what effect that was having. You know, and so these teeny tiny little components, and one of the things as well that I thought was really interesting was when two puppets are talking to each other, and this I think is very applicable to people, when two puppets are talking to each other, this one is talking, and this one, when it gets to the end of what this one is saying, receives it by going back, and then speaks forward, and then this one receives it back. And I thought that was really interesting, because so often when people are speaking to each other, the person who's talking will be, you know, leaning forward or speaking in, or, you know, and it's interesting to watch the way in which somebody, you know, receives that information. And you know, talking about earlier, receiving offers, you know, not offers in the sense of settlement offers, but offers in the sense of something that's being given you to respond to. That I thought was really interesting, to kind of, you know, take it back and then respond. You know, but it's such a small, and it happens so quickly, but it's such a small but important.
As you say, like, I think we all know that we rely on body language a lot, and we, you know, we're anticipating, oh, this is how somebody's feeling. It was interesting to break it down piece by piece, because I think we tend to see things holistically, as opposed to identify what is it that's driving that, and that might actually be a different thing. There might be a number of reasons why breathing is going a certain way, and identifying that it's actually breathing that is giving the trigger I think it's quite valuable to say, that's what I'm responding to. I recognize what it is about that person that is making me think this thing is going on, and maybe there are other things that could be causing that. It also, I think it was a reminder to me that, you know what, we make all these great assumptions that we're tracking what's going on with body language, but if there's really the subtle things, you don't necessarily notice what it is that's helping and changing it. And they're all little physical things. And so most little physical things actually can be addressed physically. Like, there's a lot of things we can do to calm breathing in the room. There's a lot of things we can do to slow things down, and if we're actually conscious that that's what I'm responding to, as opposed to you just look really upset, or you look on edge, you look like you want to say things, that's different than we need to slow it down, because that's, you know, her heart is beating too fast.
Well, some of it can even, you know, talking about the breath, can be sort of modeling, really.
That's
exactly.
Yeah, there's a whole area of work now, you know, follow their breathing, use their breathing, build on it, and use it to slow it down and
Yeah.
freshen the air and all that other kind of stuff. And it's very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was really interesting to be taking these, these small pieces of a whole that you wouldn't normally think about breaking down into those teeny chunks. And that was a really interesting part of the workshop. Like,
Yeah.
for me. Yeah.
No, for me too. I'm gonna make the comment for the people online that we have Marlene moving over to take over on the email, which is just a good reminder that if you do want to email in and participate, you can participate by speakerphone. You can also just email something in and we'll read it out. But coreclinic1@gmail.com. And I'll just make sure that you can see that it's really just toggling. So it's just checking that.
There, right?
Yeah, and nothing's in right now.
Okay. So then I'm like, how do I go?
And then just go to the other,
Just there.
there we go. And you can see what's showing because now Marlene is responsible for the camera movement. And it really looks awesome when you shoot it at yourself, Marlene. So when you're talking, it's like just.
Yeah, we discussed that.
I experienced that the last time when I was the camera operator and then was looking back at the reading club and stuff and going, yeah, we're going to
It's the lighting
be
in
more
the room.
aware.
Yes.
Yeah.
The Skype seeing your own face problem.
No, if you were seeing your own face, it wouldn't be quite so bad. It's what's the camera angle? Let's pay more attention to that. Yeah. So I don't know. Now, Marlene, you're the only one in the room who also saw Does Not Play Well with Others. So we may kind of ask you if you've got comments.
Sure. I actually did.
And did you want to turn that?
Sure.
Sorry. Well, now you're going to be just the.
Wait. Picture of
There we go.
myself.
There we go.
The news reports, the kind of the outside information and the way that kind of, in some ways, validated or just set the context for it. In some ways, it calmed it down, but in other ways, it kind of almost catastrophized it. Right? Oh, this is like the worst ever kind of thing. So the different perspective that those provided. And then the relationship between the two. They'd had a long-term relationship. Yet then they got their socks out, and there was this whole other relationship that just kind of appeared and seemed to kind of grow. And so this is really. And then did they trade socks at one point? I can't remember.
I don't recall them trading socks.
They were doing something with each other's socks or something. That's intimate, right?
Yeah.
Get away from my dirty socks kind of thing. What else did I have in there? Yeah, the technology kind of. What was this? Oh, they were icing their hands. They were constantly icing their hands, and I thought, that was kind of interesting because their hands were their crafts, and yet they were both. A very common element was that in some ways it was frozen, right? So I kind of thought that was kind of a nice little metaphor that allowed them to develop a little bit of commonality, I guess, in dealing with the outside situation. So that was a lot of what came out from me. Mostly it was the play within a play that really kind of hit me, and they were doing a lot of constantly doing these little one-offs within to different degrees of intimacy.
It was very complex the way that felt.
The guy at one point was just laying on the floor, that kind of thing, and
It's interesting. I might just ask you, Ashley, to maybe comment on it a little bit because, part of what I take when you're talking about that, Marlene, is that, we really do have those little plays within plays because we have those different relationships between different people. Here, there were only 2 people on stage, but we had a bunch of off-stage people that we had different relationships with, and we were seeing it playing out just between these 2. But extrapolating and moving into your play, it's a whole pile of little microcosms of what's going on in the larger picture, in the larger dispute. And I kind of think there's something there that is a good reminder of what's going on in most mediations, or?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, if you take sort of the metaphor from my show of the missing baggage, right? That was the overarching, you know, there was the missing bag of the head honcho, the big boss man. His bag was missing. And so for the employees of the airport, that was the big problem. And then for all these passengers arriving, all of their bags were missing, which was a problem for them, but also a problem for the airport employees. So it was like, you know, a little mountain here and then a bigger one over here that's covering up everybody. You know, and then each, you know, the character that I was playing was, I was playing the mom whose daughter had dropped a bomb on her, you know, in terms of information she did not know while they were on the flight. And she wanted to talk about it, and the daughter did not want to talk about it. And it was this really uncomfortable thing, all the while dealing with where on earth were our bags. And what was so interesting was, you know, the conflict spilling out of their own little problem onto others. So, you know, for my character, at one point she ended up wrestling with another character over a suitcase, ripping it apart, and then rather than facing her embarrassment, shouted at the airport employee. You know, which probably had very little to do with the airport employee, the other passenger, or that actual bag, and had everything to do with the conflict she was having with her daughter. And that, you know, when we're mediating, right, you're dealing with whatever it is that's the conflict, but you're also getting those people who maybe that morning had a fight with their spouse, or maybe their dog died, or maybe they're having problems at work and this dispute isn't about work, or, you know, it could be any number of things, and this just boils over and spills out in really unexpected and strange ways.
Well, and actually I kind of liked just the notion as you're talking about it, like, okay, yes, there's the problem with the supervisor's luggage,
Yes.
okay. Then there's this large pile of, you know, all the problems of everybody's luggage. But also then noticing that, okay, we've tended to think of it as the passengers as a group, and certainly the employees were kind of doing that. There was a big tendency to think of them as passengers as a group. And even the conversations, I think this is actually pretty typical of what we do, is if you group people together and say they have all the same problem, we have this tendency to say, well, go tell the passengers this, or make such and such an announcement, make them all go home. And it was actually kind of interesting, because I would have said that when they started doing a good job of resolving problems was when the employees actually spoke individually to people who had baggage problems. And they were getting, I thought, a really true reaction when they were treating it as everybody has the same problem. And they kept saying, go home, everybody go home.
Everybody was going, no, we don't want to go home. We want our bags, and then we'll go home.
Yeah, but individual conversations were giving rise to different meaning about what was the problem with the bags and all the rest. It was actually quite a nice little, it was a really nice metaphor for breaking it down a little bit, what's going on with the disputes.
Yeah, and one of the things that was interesting for me, sort of being in the middle of it, but also, you know, observing what was happening, is it just built to a point where the song we had was actually called The Revolt. Because the passengers are like, that's it, I've had enough, I'm done with this, we are taking control. But what was so interesting is you get to the end of that, where all of this anger and frustration is just, you know, directed very pointedly, and it's diffused by somebody saying, I understand, and I'm sorry that this happened to you. Which was really interesting, because it, you know, at that point, there needed to be something to diffuse the situation, and what, you know, what was used was an apology and an acknowledgement of understanding of what was going on, which, you know, which had that happened much earlier, perhaps the giant buildup wouldn't have happened, or it wouldn't have happened to the same extent. So it's interesting sometimes the timing of where that comes in.
Yeah, I mean, I think the timing is interesting. You're making me think of what happens, I think, for a lot of us. Because the one place we see theater, all of us, when we do conflict resolution training, is in role plays.
Yeah.
Right? Like we're almost inevitably thrown into role plays. And one of the reasons they've survived so long as a training tool within this context is because you get that chance to feel what it's like to receive an apology at this point. And I feel like, as a performer, in a sense, you're actually going through something similar. You've got a scripted arc, and you're supposed to be responding this way, but you almost need to. Well, you need to find that way for that to actually be meaningful and for you to have that reaction. So in essence, you're doing the opposite of what we do in a role play, right? Which is sitting there, responding to it, and thinking about, okay, how does that work? And this is, how do I get to the place? How does it take me there? And I'm just curious if you want to talk about that, because it seems to me that that's actually kind of an interesting way to think about learning about getting people there.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry. That's okay. No, I'm just trying to think how to put that in a way that's actually useful.
Okay.
No,
Yeah.
but I mean, just to kind of back up slightly.
Yeah.
One of the things, and this is, anybody who hasn't done theater before probably wouldn't necessarily know this. You're given your script, but what you are also given in one of your tasks is to take this character you've been given and learn about them, and learn what makes them tick, what works for them, and you use the script to help you develop that, but you have a lot of gaps to fill in. And one of the things that we did in this particular show was we would sit down with our scene partners, we call them, but the other person that that we were interacting with the most, and sit down with the director, and we would go through a scenario where we are just having a conversation as that person. And you're getting inside them and getting to learn about them, and through doing that you learn where some days we were not easy on the person saying to us, "I'm sorry." It's like, really? You're sorry? That did not seem like a sincere apology. And like, do it again. Do what it is that's gonna. And we actually made some script changes and some timing changes based on those reactions, where you're so inside your character that you're still reacting in a way, because it's not what you're getting back isn't working for you. And it's an interesting, it is an interesting thing to not be sort of saying, okay, well, if I say this, then this will be the reaction, and getting outside that script. I don't know if that is getting to what you were.
Yeah, no, you're getting.
Yeah.
I mean, you're definitely, and I think it's really helpful to kind of take it back to this is the process of getting there. Because, I mean, I guess what I'm thinking, and I mean, it's a new thought, so if I'm not managing to articulate it, I hadn't really thought it through. But, okay, role play, one of the challenges as somebody who is a trainer with role plays, I spend way too much time trying to encourage people to, okay, I've actually overwritten this character to try to get you to move outside yourself. And I think most of you know that I do a ton of the role plays. I was always doing them in law schools and things. So you'd have this like really homogenous group of law students who also all wanted to act like law students no matter what character you gave them. So that may have driven it for me more than people who would be training in other contexts more frequently, because there wasn't this mix and diversity of the way people reacted. So you'd give them a character to play, and they would get into it a little bit, but it would always turn into law students arguing and wanting to be reasonable and wanting to do things and to think in a certain way and to approach them in a certain way. And it strikes me that while there's great value in that, and I've rarely had anybody not say, after a role play, it's okay, that was really important because playing the character made me understand how I would respond if somebody did that. And that's valuable for sure. And you take that away and you learn it. But you're only learning about yourself. and how I respond to it.
Mhm.
And in a context where everybody's being themselves and responding to it, you often get those really homogenous groups, and you're not getting a lot of, okay, that would work. And so you'll also get, like, I mean, one of the things I think of with law schools in particular, because everybody's in this rational thinking mode where that is being valued above all, you'll often find people saying that they're not using acknowledgement of emotion, for instance. Is, well, you know, that didn't really get me there. That just kind of irritated me when you said that.
Yeah.
Well, sure, because you're this person.
Yeah.
Can you imagine being a person who might respond differently to that? And it seems to me that what you're talking about, putting yourself in a different kind of character, has enormous value to being able to be a mediator too, to be able to see, like, I can get to a place where I'm thinking of what a different person might respond to.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think if, you know, for me putting myself into that character, a lot of the time, you know, if I'm mediating, I'm putting myself into the character of Ashley the mediator,
Yeah,
as
that
well,
too.
too, you know,
Yeah.
which is not necessarily going to, you know, involve the same reactions that Ashley the regular human is going to have. Partly because I'm trying to, you know, assist with the situation, but it really does, you know, we talk, I think, a lot about putting yourself in the perspective, you know, or looking at things from the perspective of that other person, you know, put yourself in their shoes. But when you're actually able to do that a little further, you know, which I think involves knowing a lot about people and watching them and paying attention to them, saying, okay, well, you know, these are the things that I'm seeing that make this person tick. So what's going to assist the best with that, or what's not going to work, or you know, and I've always found that interesting with role playing, and I, you know, as a person who does theater, find it especially fascinating, I think.
Yeah.
But also sometimes just frustrating, because, you know, you think, okay, well, people, you know, these people are just trying to act the bit. But there was one experience I had doing mediation training where we were doing a role play, and for some reason I had the, you know, fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you look at it, situation of being the most junior person in the entire room, being chucked into a group with all of the most senior people in the room, who just decided not to make it easy on me, which is fair enough. But talking about the emotion, one of the people in this group who was playing the part of one of the parties who had had this sort of horrible thing happen to them, she got really emotional. She had put herself so deep into this character that she was playing that she at one point actually started to cry while she was speaking during the role play. And because this was a very controlled situation and I was being the mediator, I had to call time, because I didn't quite know, you know, because you're thinking of it as a role play situation rather than thinking of it as a real situation. Because I needed to take a minute. That would have been the moment where I would have, you know, split rooms, caucus, you know, give myself a minute, because I was having a hard time dealing with it. It was interesting because, you know, it's sort of, you know, it was theater. It was a piece of theater, but it really wasn't. It became real really quickly, which was unexpected.
Yeah.
So.
And they can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I know that you've got a question there, so I'm thinking we should go to the question and then we can
I think we've got some
come back.
comments here.
Great.
Alexander Danilovic, am I saying that right? Sharon, your comment of seeing your face online, facilitating resolution of conflict, brought to mind the possibility of whether playback theater might be effective in conflict resolution, where the positions, quote, in quotes, and interests, in quotes, of the parties would be immediately acted out by improv actors, and whether whether by this means a cathartic or breakthrough effect might be achieved in terms of realizing an image of the self from a comedic or tragic perspective.
Yeah, do people know what playback theater is?
No.
I remember from last year's conference.
Yeah, and people who were at the conference last year, the dispute resolution conference, we did bring in for the CLE, we brought in a playback theater troupe, which was cool, and we did a really short segment, but it was a chance to explore what playback is. And just if you haven't seen it, it developed out of therapy, really. So it was sociodrama and psychodrama. And the idea is that you have a troupe that actually performs somebody's story.
Oh, cool.
So a person will tell a story to the group and say, here's what it is. And they'll answer some questions about it, and you'll have a basic sense of some kind of conflict. And then the troupe will get on stage and they will improvise that story. They often have a musician accompanying, so there can be, not for singing usually, but often to create atmosphere
And sound effects.
and sound effects. And you've identified somebody. If you're the person whose story is being told, you choose amongst the actors, who is you? And you often get to contribute, okay, and this person is the person I'm having the conflict with, and this person is the person who had played this role. And so it's like, who resonates with you amongst those actors, and you've seen them do something. And for whatever reason, who do I think gets me a little bit? And watching them perform it, because they know very little about you, they haven't met you in most circumstances. I mean, sometimes this is done in a much more psychotherapeutic environment, and you might be there for a week together, and you actually do start knowing each other, and you'll be playing each other differently. But this is them taking a stab at what that story would be like for them and playing it out. And it is a very fascinating thing to have that view of, wow, okay, so, no, I don't, you're kind of questioning, like, I wouldn't have responded that way, that's kind of weird, that's not very true. And yet, you still get some different insight, because somebody made a different choice than you did. It's actually really a big insight for you, because they know my story, they know how it ends, and yet they're getting there a completely different way.
Yeah.
So it's quite,
I would think so.
I think that it has an enormous amount of potential. One of the challenges is, for conflict, is getting the right people together to do something like that. But with a prolonged conflict and a family kind of situation, for instance, there might be some real value, because there's the ongoing relationship. It's going to stretch over a really long period of time. I mean, there's absolutely potential for these kind of tools to come into play.
Yeah, especially where it's a not just a long-term relationship,
Yeah.
but one that you would like to continue in a
Yeah.
positive way, or that needs to continue for whatever reason. Yeah.
And that's what I'm
Yeah.
thinking more is, like, when
Yeah.
I'm talking family, I'm thinking more the,
Oh, yeah.
you've got kids and
Yeah,
you're
and
going to
you've
be
got
together
it.
forever.
Yeah.
And that's maybe not, the only way that these things play out. It could
Yeah.
be something quite different. It could be workplace really easily.
That's
Yeah,
what I was
that's what I was
thinking.
thinking.
Yeah,
It would
where
be
you've
nice
got
in workplace,
like
yeah.
partners in a business who,
Yeah.
they each bring such an integral part that they need each other in order for this thing to continue, whatever it is. But yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I think playback has a huge amount of potential. I think we saw playback being done as a playback, and they're usually longer projects. There are a lot of other things that come out of the same work. It's Jonathan Fox in New York who developed most of the tools, and he developed them as part of his psychotherapy projects. But there's also Moreno, what's his first name? Who was the original? He originated the psychotherapy and sociodrama. So psychodrama and sociodrama projects. A lot of interesting stuff if you read some of his work that I think has direct application to conflict resolution, because what he has done is create games in the psychodrama, it's for individuals that are used in a psychotherapeutic model. But the sociodrama is about groups and identifying different linkages between groups, the ways the relationships work. And some of it is just making, the term that gets used is making the implicit explicit. So it's choosing ways to actually visualize what is going on in a relationship. And sometimes it's really simple. But there's no question in my mind that you could take some really fascinating tools out of sociodrama in particular. Is really easy in some ways because it's about a group and showing the group dynamic. And you could do a lot with it.
It sounds very interesting. I was thinking, as you were talking, Sharon, that
Do you wanna-
what you see when you see somebody else reenact your story is something that I don't think, for myself anyways, that I see sometimes in interpersonal reaction. Because my focus is on the other person. And I don't actually see my part. And I'm thinking in conflict, how often we can't resolve our conflict because we haven't come to terms with our part in it.
Yeah.
And that would give you that insight that you may be lacking
Yeah.
as a party involved in the conflict. Because our focus is always on what that guy did,
Absolutely.
not on what I'm doing.
Yeah. And seeing it played out that way it's relatively neutral, right? Because one of the things that psychodrama, for instance, one of the typical tools is exchanging roles. So you do role reversal. So you actually will work with somebody, and you will take their part, they will take your part, and you will engage that way. And I've heard of people talking about doing it in different mediations in different contexts. Like I know that it is something that people toy with. But part of the challenge is if you're really angry, you play the person like they're a jerk. Yeah, exactly. It's like,
Yeah.
and you end up with like almost a worse situation.
Yeah.
But the psychodrama, having somebody who has a more neutral view of it, performing it for you, and maybe not in front of the other person, is actually quite interesting.
Well, and particularly when I'm thinking of it in the context of family, where we get so entrenched in the context of family or close relationships, in our focus on the other person, and never our focus on what is our part in it, and how could we change the interaction by changing our role, or how we react, or how we act.
Well, okay, I want to hold that thought because it sounds like you've got another comment there.
Carrie, yeah.
But if you could, it may be that she talks about it anyway, but if not, maybe remind me about Theatre of the Oppressed, because I think that's actually kind of a direct response to that too.
This is from Carrie Boyle. Ashley's spillover observation is helpful and reminds me of the iceberg. What it's presenting on the surface often has nothing to do with the real dispute or conflict. It takes time and patience to dig more deeply to get out at what is really the problem. Also the magic of empathy, understanding. What lessons are here for conflict resolution professionals?
Great.
Yeah, well,
That's maybe a thank you, Carrie.
that is
Great
a
comment.
thank
Yeah,
you, thank you.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean that's exactly it, right? There will always be something below the surface. What it is and how big it is and how much of an actual effect it has on the dispute that we are dealing with in whatever scenario. I mean, that's going to vary every time, but I think going into it, reminding ourselves that there will always be something there that we don't know about.
Yeah.
And I think keeping in mind too that, I mean, the spillover thing that I was talking about, is something that I think is really easy to forget. I know I forget that when somebody is reacting, at me in some really strong way, where I think like, gee, that's an incredible overreaction to whatever it is that's going on. I so often forget that, well, that might actually have nothing to do with, with this. And I think it's, in a situation where you're in a setting where you're acting as the conflict resolution professional and something like that happens, it might be a useful thing to be able to convey to the other parties in the room that, maybe this, and not say, well, this has to do with this other thing, but have a discussion about reactions not always being a direct reaction to the thing that's going on right there, that there are other things that play into that. And I think reminding people might have some real benefit, depending on the scenario. But I think that reminder, when
It's interesting. interesting when you're just talking about playback theater and whether or not that would actually,
Yeah.
you know, you
Yeah.
see somebody playing you and they're acting all weird. It makes you kind of think, okay, so what is really going on here for myself?
Mhm.
Or, you know, if you're used to dealing with somebody and you see somebody else playing them and you think, gee, that's not really a normal reaction to something. And, you know,
Yeah.
so, yeah, maybe another opportunity there.
Yeah, well, and I do think that, I mean, while I might not frequently want to say, hey, let's do a role reversal in a mediation, in a caucus saying, you know, all right, pretend to be the other person for a minute. All right, and I'm going to ask you some questions and see if you can come up with, because if you're coaching somebody through that process and questioning whether they're being real about it, that I could see. The direct exchange does tend to have that escalation of, you
Yeah.
know, but in a caucus, there's no particular reason why you couldn't with somebody who was willing to try it. Just say,
Yeah.
okay, let's just really explicitly put you in somebody else's shoes and let's, you know, see if we can get at it. Because I'm hearing you, you know, identify a lot of motivation that you think is happening for that other person.
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah.
kind of go through that. Play the person.
and it could be actually a useful thing too, depending on what the situation is, where you've got more than one person in that caucus room, to maybe not get the person that's directly involved, but get the other person in the room to do that. Like I was just thinking about a situation a couple of weeks ago where I was actually counsel in the mediation. I wasn't the mediator, and my client was just not seeing the perspective of the other party, and I knew it was there, and I knew that, you know, in order for us to get this thing resolved, she needed to get there, and so I did it for her.
Yeah.
And said, well, okay, let me tell you what I'd be thinking if I was sitting in that other room. I would be seeing this and this, and I would be thinking that, and what do you think about that? And I was being a little bit of interventionist counsel, which needed to happen there. But, you know, even if it's not somebody who's counsel, if it's, you know, sometimes people will have a friend or a family member or another person that they consider to be on their side.
Yeah.
Sometimes getting them to do that might be a useful useful thing.
No, absolutely. I think
Yeah.
there's often that person
Yeah.
who is able to put themselves in that place because they don't have to let go of their own
Yeah.
position
Yeah.
and this is who I am, and I don't have to show that I can get into that other person's mind, and they might well have somebody in the room with them who can do exactly that. It's interesting. I was just, Suzanne, when you were talking about a little bit of the playback theater and seeing yourself and all of that, one of the things you said, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but you triggered the thought for me about Theatre of the Oppressed, because you were making me think about the chance to see different interventions, which is exactly what the Theatre of the Oppressed evolved into with the Forum Theatre. And so it struck me that that's something that's worth mentioning. And I don't know how many people are familiar with it. Is it something people have seen? Here it would normally be Theatre for Living. David Diamond does some in Vancouver, and he's probably one of the only people really doing much of it in Vancouver. But I'm going to throw that name out there, and I'm going to highly recommend that you watch out for stuff. I know that they're putting together a project that is on reconciliation, for instance, in February, March. But it's absolutely fascinating. So, I mean, his projects are really, really big, but the actual concept of Forum Theatre is that you work through, you create a play with people who are engaged in that problem, whatever that problem is. And you would stage, the play will have moments of crisis, and it keeps escalating to the point of crisis. It doesn't resolve itself. And it plays out, showing all of these different escalating crises. It can be different elements of the same problem playing out. And then you play it again, and audience members are able to say, stop. And they step in and take the place of one of the characters and play against the other character or characters in the scene. And they try to do something different. And often it doesn't work, but sometimes it does. And it's all about kind of tracking what are those different interactions and seeing something that is different than you might have tried, And it's incredibly powerful and often used in that context. And as I say, David Diamond's usually doing it as more of a broad community issue, like reconciliation. But the actual tool can certainly be utilized in smaller groups and in smaller ways, and focused on, just this problem, and let's explore it as a group. Let's test different interventions and see what works and what feels true. And when you talk about kind of, okay, they might have to try that a few times because it doesn't seem like a sincere apology or whatever, that build. This is even more free-flowing because you can try a bunch of different things. It's not scripted.
Yeah.
But you know what you're reacting to on the other side, so you're getting a chance to try different interventions. I actually think it has tremendous potential in our world, and would love to see more of it, and see more of our conflict resolution people get some kind of exposure and training in it too.
Yeah, I could see that being great in the workplace.
Yeah,
Cultural issues too.
And
Absolutely.
Community issues.
community issues is huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, as I say, David's the only one who's been doing a lot here. If you haven't seen it, I think you can still see the one when it was still Headlines Theatre before they changed the name. They also did a legislative theatre project, and they were the first ones in North America to do legislative theatre, which is taking another step. It's partnering with a government, and then you run the play in a series of places. And Carrie Gallant was the lawyer on that, and there actually is a lawyer attached who tracks the interventions and prepares and submits proposals for legislative change to resolve the problem.
Fascinating.
Like, it's so cool. Yeah, I
That's
mean,
great.
it's Augusto Boal created the whole thing, and he did run for municipal council. I don't remember what the council name is called, but in Brazil. So when he went into politics, local politics, he took his theater of the oppressed and he created this legislative theater as a way to get input from marginalized communities and voices that wouldn't be heard otherwise.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
That's great.
But yeah, so Carrie Gallant, I chat with her too if you want to follow up on it, because she's like the one person in town who's been a lawyer on a legislative theater project.
That's
Yeah.
Sharon,
You have to go,
I have to
don't
go.
you?
So if you have any last little things that you,
Well, let's ask if there's any last minute things from
Yes, I-
the online audience while we're looking around. And I will apologize to the online audience, because if you do have a last minute thing, I realize there's a little bit of a lag with the with what you're seeing, so you might actually not
well,
get
then
the
email
chance.
me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can
yeah, Yeah, they can email me, knowing that I'm flying to London tomorrow, and will not be checking my email after that. But email me before tomorrow morning.
All right. And later, will you eventually be back, Ashley?
Yes, eventually I will be back, I will answer then. It just, if you have a really burning question, I hope you can hang on to it for a couple weeks.
All right. And should they just find your email address at your law firm website?
Yeah, I'm Ashley at sirelaw.ca, and Sire is SYER. So
Okay.
yeah, great. Thank you, everybody. Sorry to run.
No problem. You've lasted almost the whole time.
I have, yes, and I
Thank you very much.
Yes, my pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. And I will just ask what others, other observations and things, because that's really, we've got kind of 10 minutes, not even that. So I'm looking around. You've been very quiet. Did you have an observation you wanted to make at the end?
Well, today's theme is conflict resolution and fringe theater.
Yeah.
And I just can't help but remind myself, sort of like my first exposure to Canadian law was when I was very young. I would go to the PNE, and there were these law students playing moot court in the exhibition building.
Oh, okay.
Yes, far too young to be real judges and lawyers, but they were playing a moot court.
Interesting.
Exactly. So that sort of got me. I remember I was 12 or 11 at the time. That sort of got me interested in law already.
Huh.
Okay, that's right. Okay, that and TV shows like Street Legal, but again, Street Legal, moot court at PNE, it's all about, the key word is stage, because the stage is not the natural environment. It's not the natural environment of the participants, right? And that's why, and as such, the person that, if I were a media and I'm seeing the person there who's participating, that's not the real person, because that person is not in his or her natural environment. He or she was brought into the table probably by her lawyer, right? Okay, or for whatever reason, right? And that's where we have to realize that there is something more than what they're actually saying. Maybe caucus meeting bring that out, but certainly when in an open meeting, you know, there could be just, again, playing a role, okay? Right? And there's more than what meets the eye. But I wrote here. Puppeteers express more when speaking through puppets. When we were talking about the puppets, it just got me thinking, as a person who comes from, in some way, who's a very bicultural person, who speaks two different languages. One minute I'm in the culture of my ancestors, and then in another minute I'm in the culture of Canadian culture, society. Okay, right? Puppets, the puppeteers themselves, they have two personalities. They're in two different worlds. There's the world where they're playing as the puppets, and then there's themselves. I'm saying, like I said, if we were to do a mediation involving certain ethnic, certain cultural minority group, right? How can I say this? Speaking through a puppet is like speaking through a different language.
Interesting.
Okay, that's how I see it as.
Yeah.
Speaking through a puppet is like speaking through a different language. And if the mediation is engaged in a different language, I like to think that perhaps the mediation would be totally different. People would say things that they would not otherwise say in English, right? Okay, because it raises that dreaded philosophical hypothesis, Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, saying that depending on the language we speak, we act, or the language we speak dictates the way we behave and our perspective on things.
Interesting. You know what's like that's a really fascinating observation, Kenny. And in particular, I'm kind of thinking, I've had conversations with quite a few people who they and their spouse, for instance, it's often other family members, I'm going to get you to turn that only because only to make sure the microphone's working. I think I'm close enough that it doesn't matter that I'm behind it, but just in case, it's an annoyingly directional microphone. But so several times I've had people make the comment that, you know, when my spouse and I argue, we speak 4 different languages. We all speak the same languages, but we argue in specific language. We always go into a particular language for an argument. And I've heard different comments about which languages are the most, I don't know, most suitable for having an argument. But it's really quite interesting. And hearing those kind of comments, I've heard them now quite a lot of times. And when you're making that comment about, we might say something quite different if I were speaking in a different language, it's kind of resonating with me that, yeah, because people who want to have a fight sometimes go into a specific language to kind of engage in an aggressive way. Switching languages certainly has that potential. And it's an interesting observation to think of it as that distancing. Puppet says something different, you say something different.
Right, because when a puppeteer speaks to a puppet, he's not using his or her natural voice. He's using a different voice.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? So it's like speaking through a different language. Even though it's English or whatever, it's the same language, linguistically speaking, right? But it's a totally different language when you're speaking through a puppet.
Cool.
It's not you anymore.
All right, we're kind of we're right at time. I'm thinking we should probably wrap up. Just because, although, I mean, I don't want to cut off any conversation if somebody had something they really wanted to say, or if there was one last comment coming online. All right. Well, then I'm going to say thanks, and I'm going to remind you, October 17th, because it is a date change. And I think it'll be really interesting. Words matter. I actually think it's going to be a nice follow-on now that we've had this conversation. I wasn't necessarily linking them, but having had this conversation, managing ourselves when giving and receiving feedback, it becomes actually, I think we're going to have some interesting conversations with that. So Carrie and Julie, and it's a Monday. It's a Monday, yeah. I'm going to highlight that because we often don't do Mondays. But we have the room on Monday, and we're in the other room too, for those of you who are here physically present. We're in the large room. Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thank you to everybody online.
Okay.
And now I'll close off. Thanks. Sorry, you're getting captured because I'm having trouble finding out where the turn it off is. Should say stop on here. All right.
Oh, I'm sorry I didn't get to the place.
It was really good.
I
And I'd
know.
never been to the Review Theater before. What a great little venue.
Well,
eh?
that's.
It is, isn't it?